And so, sadly, this is the last chapter that we'll be studying in the book of Daniel, at least for a while. I'm not sure if the series goes back through any part of the book of Daniel or not, but obviously there are more books and subjects in the Bible than Daniel, and they're put there for a reason. And so, Lord willing, we're going to start studying about John the Baptist a little bit, and Jesus and his birth, and things of that nature. If you're familiar with Daniel chapter 6, though, you'll know this as the chapter that contains the story of Daniel and the lion's den. And I'm not really going to talk about that story. Well, I guess I'm going to talk about that story, but not the specifics of it until probably a little bit later this evening. We're going to look at a second part or a second lesson in this chapter. Then, Lord willing, we can talk a little bit more about it there. But I do want to emphasize a little bit about some of the context that has taken place, the history that has led up to this chapter. And then we want to talk about the difference between two different types of people that you see a contrast throughout this chapter. Now remember at the end of chapter 5 that Belshazzar, the kingdom is taken away from him. And so that night, the Bible tells us at the end of that chapter, that night Darius the Mede becomes the king over the empire, what was formerly known as the Empire of Babylonia. Now, you can imagine whenever a new king and a new empire takes place, that king is going to rearrange the government. And if I had to liken it unto something that we would think of today, I would think of the difference when a Democrat or a Republican enters into office. You know, when one of them is leaving or one of them is entering, what happens? Well, usually they clean house. I mean, they take everybody that has been appointed to a position and they take them out of that and they reappoint somebody else that is in line with their thinking and their core values and what they really want to see accomplished. And so you can imagine Darius the Mede reconstructs the government of that particular kingdom. And what's interesting to me is whenever you see all these kings changing and these governments changing and even different empires arising, there's one guy who's still staying in the spotlight in all this, and that's Daniel. And it's so amazing that he's able to stay in these places where he has been appointed. Now remember, Belshazzar promised Daniel that if he would interpret this handwriting on the wall, that he would be appointed third in his kingdom. Daniel didn't want any of that, but nonetheless, Belshazzar had promised it, and so whenever Daniel did interpret that dream, he was elevated to the third position within the kingdom itself. Now, it was a short-lived position under the rule of Belshazzar, but nonetheless, under Darius the Mede, Daniel is going to continue to prosper. And today I want to look at and to think about this idea. Whenever you see believers and unbelievers living together, and that's what Daniel was. He was a believer in God. And he had all these idolatrous people who were surrounding him and living alongside with him. There's always going to be a contrast between the lives of these two individuals. And you'll see that time and time again as you read throughout Daniel chapter 6 here. Now, think about it. That's true whether you're talking about a family unit. It's true whether you're talking about the church. It's true whether you're talking about a business or corporations or even in government. Believers living alongside unbelievers, there's going to be a difference between the two lives that these people live. And so that's what I want to concentrate here on in about these first 16 verses here in Daniel chapter 6. The contrast that exists between these people, the people of God and the people of the world. And one of the first things that I want to talk about is the difference of the character that is being displayed. And you see that in the way that Darius feels toward these people. Notice in verse 1, it says, "It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 princes, which should be over the whole kingdom. And over these 3 presidents, of whom Daniel was first, that the princes might give accounts unto them, and the king should have no damage." That's interesting to me that whenever, again, Darius is setting up this empire, this kingdom, like he wants to see it run, he basically has his kingdom divided into 120 provinces. And over every one of these provinces, he has a prince that is appointed to oversee or administrate over that province. Now, he also appointed over these 120 princes 3 main rulers. And the Bible tells us that the first one of those was Daniel. Now, stop and think about why he was set over it. In verse 2, it tells us this. It says, these three men were appointed over these princes, that they should give account unto them, and that the king should have no damage. Stop for just a moment and think about these guys that you're appointing here. And I don't know if Darius naturally suspected that these weren't the most honest of guys, that they needed to be watched, or that was just the way that he decided to set up his government. But it seems to me that there's a little bit of cynicism when it comes to these guys. Maybe they're not trustworthy guys. You know, maybe I can't be sure that they're going to do what's best for me. Or maybe I can't be sure that when I tell them to do something that they're actually going to carry out that work. And so I'm going to appoint three major guys over all these other guys to make sure that I don't suffer any loss and no harm comes to me. Well, that's just natural because as the king, understand it would have been impossible for Darius to supervise every worker that he had. There's just no way humanly possible that he could go out into all his empire every single day and look at every single worker that was trying to do something within his empire. He couldn't audit every account that he had. I imagine there were a number of different types of businesses that were being conducted by him or under his supervision. But it was impossible for him to do all those things personally himself. He couldn't check on every assignment that he had been given, or he had given out to people. He just couldn't do that. And so what does he do? He has to depend on other people to check on those things for him. And if you're going to depend on other people to check things for you, you want people you can trust, don't you? Well, there were three main guys that he put in charge of all this. I just don't see the same confidence in these 120 that he shows in these three main characters. But he did have a feeling of confidence in these three men. And the Bible tells us that one of these men was Daniel. Look at verse 3. It says, "Then this Daniel was preferred above the presidents and princes, because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king thought to set him over the whole realm." It's once again interesting to me. This guy is really just coming into office, but he knows about Daniel. Daniel, we've always talked about this. Daniel had this reputation among the people. And so if you were looking for somebody who you could trust, if you were looking for somebody who you could confide in, Daniel would have been a name that would have been commonly mentioned in that day and age. Well, he probably had heard about the reputation of Daniel, and it didn't take him very long to figure out that everything that people said about Daniel was true. There was something different about him. He had an excellent spirit. The Bible talks about in chapter 5 how he had the wisdom of the gods. He's very skilled in the things that he does, but he was also very honest, a man of integrity. And those things were reflected in the life that he lived. Daniel's character was so impeccable. Think about this. Of all the people that Darius could have trusted, there was one that he trusted above all others. You know who it was? It was Daniel. That shows you a little bit about just how good of a person Daniel was. And so his thought process is this: eventually, I'm going to set Daniel over the entire kingdom. Okay, I'm only going to have one guy who's in charge and one guy who's overseeing everything that happens, and that man is going to be Daniel. Now, I wish it was always the case that the most honest employee gets the promotion, but that's not always the way that it works in our world today. But there's a great lesson for us as Christians. It's always better to maintain our integrity than to sacrifice it for your job or for money. And Daniel was a man who did that. He always stuck to being an honest person and being truthful, and in the long run, it paid off for him. I know that Christians today get passed up for promotions. I know that they get passed up for salary increases because a lot of times somebody up higher doesn't really care for them or doesn't really like them. But in the end, all of us are going to be rewarded one day. And so I want us to stop and think about this idea, the different feelings that Darius had toward different people in his kingdom. There was some people that he totally trusted, that he was confident in. He could tell them to do anything. He could turn over anything into their hands, and it was going to be done, and it was going to be done right. And his best interest was always going to be at heart. But there were other people who he didn't feel were so trustworthy. People that needed to be checked up on. People that
needed to be overseen so that no damage or harm came to him or to his empire. And I kind of think about that idea, the idea of integrity, the idea of character. It is so important in our world today. It's important within the family unit. All of us need people within our family unit who are people of integrity, people who we can trust, people who we know that have our best interest at heart. It's important in the business world. Any business or corporation will tell you, if I have a person working for me and they don't have the company's best interest at heart, I don't want that person working for me. It's important to be on that same page. And so all of us need to understand that it's important in the world in which we live, but it's also important in spiritual matters and within the church. And so I want us to think about, I wanted to spend just a little bit on it this morning and think about, how does God feel toward us? When God tells us to do something, does he look at us and say, now that's a person that I can trust? I know they're going to do it. I know they're going to do it right. I know that they have the church's best interest at heart and my best interest at heart. And I have total confidence in them that whatever I ask of them, they will do it. Abraham was a man like that. Remember what God said in Genesis chapter 18 and verse 19? He was talking about destroying the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. And he says, shall I hide from Abraham this thing that I am about to do? And then he says this, he says, for I know him, that he will command his children and his household after him, and they shall keep the way of the Lord to do justice and judgment. God was confident in Abraham. He was confident that he was a man of integrity. He was a person who would do whatever he asked him or told him to do. How does God feel toward us? Does God have that same confidence, or does God have that apprehension toward us? Does he look at us and say, I don't know if I can trust them or not? They need somebody to supervise them or to oversee them so that they're going to do what I tell them to do, and things are going to be, my best interest is going to be at heart, and the church's best interest is going to be at heart too. That was the difference in the kind of character in Daniel's day in Daniel chapter 6. Let's talk a little bit about the type of conduct that we see, the difference between the behavior of the world and the behavior of God's people. One of the things that really stands out to me is these worldly minded people are trying to make things that God has said is right into being wrong. And I want you to stop and to think about that situation. Does that ring a bell today? I mean, these were people who were trying to change right into wrong and wrong into right. Isaiah wrote about the people of his day in Isaiah chapter 5 who did that very thing, who called right wrong and who called wrong right. And so you see that in the behavior of these men. Notice in verse 4 here of Daniel chapter 6. It says, then the presidents and princes sought to find occasion against Daniel concerning the kingdom. But they could find none occasion nor fault, for as much as he was faithful, neither was there any error or fault found in him. Then said these men, we shall not find any occasion against this Daniel, except we find it against him concerning the law of his God. Now I want you to stop and to think about the story that we've just read. Here's Darius. He's appointed up, he's divided up, he's set up his government like he wants it to function. Daniel is one of the primary three people in this government. It's in the mind of Darius that one day Daniel is going to be number one. Daniel is going to be appointed over the entire kingdom. And so when these people hear, these other people hear about the king's plan to promote Daniel, it probably irritated them a little bit. Probably rubbed them the wrong way. And they looked at Daniel and they said, we got to do something. We got to find something in his word so that he doesn't get that promotion. We can't allow a foreigner or stranger to be appointed number one over our entire kingdom. Maybe they were a little bit dishonest. Maybe they were trying to use things to their advantage. Maybe they wanted to get rid of Daniel so that they could do those very things. I don't know all the minute details behind the scenes, but I do know that they decided this: we're going to find something wrong with Daniel. You know what happened? They searched, and they searched, and they searched. And they could find nothing wrong in the life of Daniel. They couldn't find one accusation that they could bring up to the king. They couldn't find one thing that they could spin in the wrong direction to try to get Daniel in a bad position with the king. And think about the character of Daniel. Think about how that speaks volume about how commendable his character was. Can you imagine a character so impeccable that if somebody were to look at your life today, they could find absolutely nothing wrong within it? They could find nothing to accuse you of, nothing that they could even try to spin in a different direction. And so they're looking at Daniel and they're saying, this isn't going to work. There's nothing that we can do. There's nothing that we can say that's going to put him in a bad position. He's not tempted to do anything illegal. We can't tempt him by trying to break anything according to the king's law. And so they said, this is what we've got to do. The only way that we can get Daniel to do something wrong is to make his religious practices illegal. And so that's what they set out to do. Once again, think about some of the conditions that exist in our world today, how similar they are to what we're reading about here with Daniel. And one of the things that I admire about Daniel is even though he was in the midst of a very perverse and corrupt society, he did not try to hide his religion. I mean, the fact that he was a religious individual, the fact that he prayed 3 times every day was well known throughout the entire empire. He's openly professing and practicing what he believes. But here they are, and they're out trying to make that which is right into wrong. They're trying to make the commandments, the religious practices that God has given Daniel to observe illegal. And so how do they do that? Well, they use craftiness and compliments. Notice in verse 6, it says, Then these presidents and princes assembled together to the king and said thus unto him, King Darius, live forever. All the presidents of the kingdom, the governors and the princes, the counselors and the captains have consulted together to establish a royal statute and to make a firm decree that whosoever shall ask a petition of any god or man for 30 days, save of thee, O king, he shall be cast into the den of lions. Now, O king, establish the decree and sign the writing, that it be not changed according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which altereth not. Wherefore King Darius signed the writing and the decree. Now, think about Darius here, and this is probably something that he had yet to see in his short reign. But all of these princes and all these, his entire government is united. I mean, can you imagine that in our society today? His entire government is united. And they come before him. And here's what they say in verse 7. They say, all the presidents of the kingdom, all the governors, all the princes, all the counselors, all the captains have consulted together. We've all gotten together and we've all had a talk and we've all agreed what unity there was in this decision. And so that had to be something that was greatly impressed upon the mind of Darius. But the problem is this. There was at least one person who was absent from that assembly, and that person was Daniel. And even though Daniel wasn't there, or else he was there and he disagreed, they take it upon themselves to speak for Daniel, or at least lie for Daniel. And so they give the impression that every governor and every prince and every ruler in all your kingdom is on board. You know, all of us thought this was a good decision and a good law. And so what we want to do is we want to unite this kingdom. Well, that's what any king wants. He wants to see his kingdom united in different ways, whether it's through religion or whatever. He wants unity within his kingdom. And so basically they said, we decided it would be great if we made you God for 30 days. And nobody can pray to anyone or anybody except to you, because you're the king of this entire nation. That will bring everybody together. And so the king, the way that this plan was conceived and the way that it was presented, I'll give them this, it was very clever. Okay? Darius wanted to unify the kingdom. I think that they knew this. The impression was everybody within the realm of government is on board with this law. They're good with it. What better way would there be than to establish unity and bring everybody together than to pass this law, to sign it into decree? And that's what Darius does. Now, the Bible warns us about compliments and the way that worldly people often use compliments to accomplish what they want to see accomplished. One of those verses is found in Psalm 5 and verse 9. The psalmist there says this. He says, for there is no faithfulness in their mouth. He's talking about the mouth of the wicked. Their inward part is very wickedness. Their throat is an open sepulchre. They flatter, with their tongue? Why do the people of the world use flattery? Why do they use their tongue in a way to make people feel good about themselves, which is what they were doing to King Darius here. Everybody loves you. Everybody thinks that you should be God. Everybody wants you to be in charge for 30 days. That had to feel good as a man to Darius. But flattery, the reason that they use flattery is to manipulate. They didn't care anything about the king. That's not why they were coming before him with this royal decree. The only reason they came with this decree was because they wanted to see Daniel destroyed. And so they were willing to say anything in order to see that accomplished. Darius, his downfall, succumbed to the flattery of men. He was willing to do whatever they asked of him simply because they were saying good things about him. And he lived to regret it. But flattery is a means and a method that's used by the world to manipulate people, to get what they want to get out of people and out of this world. And so you see these worldly men using this manipulation. It's interesting to contrast the way that they're living and conducting themselves with how Daniel behaves. And what's interesting to me is verse 10 here. The Bible tells us that when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went into his house, and his windows being open in his chamber toward Jerusalem, he kneeled upon his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before God as he did aforetime. These men had assembled in verse 11, we learned, and they found Daniel making these prayers and these supplications. And think about how quickly they put this law into practice. I bet they couldn't wait to get the king's decree out and to get that law into effect, because they knew the sooner they got this law into effect, the sooner they were going to be able to get rid of Daniel. And so here you read about these men, probably at the earliest opportunity, they set out to trap Daniel. They're waiting. They're waiting. They knew where Daniel went to pray. They knew what time he went to pray. And they're just waiting for him to show up and to offer up a prayer to somebody other than the king. And so when he does that, they take that opportunity again to arrest him. And if Daniel hadn't been that man of faith and courage, he might have found a way to compromise. He might have found a way to try to make some excuse for not maintaining his faithful prayer life. And honestly, I don't know that I could have done what Daniel did. Daniel opened the windows when he prayed. I might have closed the windows after I knew that writing was signed. Daniel did this. He prayed evidently out loud where they actually heard who he was praying to and what he was saying, or else they couldn't have convicted him of that. I might have said, I'll just go silent for 30 days. Silent prayer, instead of speaking out loud. I might have even said in my heart, well, I'll just change the place. These guys think I come here every time. It's no big deal if I go down the road or go somewhere else and pray to God. Do you know what changed for Daniel? Absolutely nothing. He just kept on serving God faithfully like he had always done. He knew what was right. He wasn't going to change anything about his conduct. He wasn't going to rearrange his life because some physical law, some decree of the king had been passed. He was just going to keep on serving God like he had always done. And what they do, they spied on him, they heard him, and so they bring the report to the king. Notice the difference in behavior, the conduct of these two groups of people. The third thing that I want for you to notice is how they used the human power and authority that was given to them. There's one group of people who uses it in a very corrupt way, and there's another group that uses it for a very noble purpose. That's Daniel and his friends. But we do know this. They used this authority that had been given to them to make it a crime to pray to the God of Israel. So notice what we read in verse 12. It says, Then they came near and spake before the king concerning the king's decree. They've already caught Daniel in the act. He's been arrested. They said, Hast thou not signed a decree that every man that shall ask a petition of any god or man within 30 days, save of thee, O king, shall be cast into a den of lions? The king answered and said, The thing is true, according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which altereth not. Then answered they and said before the king, That Daniel, which is of the children of the captivity of Judah, regardeth not thee, O king, nor the decree which thou hast signed, but maketh his petition 3 times a day. Notice verse 15. Then these men assembled unto the king and said unto the king, Know, O king, that the law of the Medes and the Persians is, that no decree nor statute which the king established may be changed. Then the king commanded, and they brought Daniel and cast him into the den of lions. You know, these men who had spied on Daniel hurried to inform Darius that Daniel had disobeyed the king. It's always remarkable to me. I'm not just talking about in the Bible. I'm talking about even in our world today. How quickly people can come together. How quickly people can unite for something evil and wicked. But yet they find it so hard to agree and to unify to do something good. These men, when it came to getting Daniel and getting him out of the office, they were like this. I mean, they were bound to one another. But I imagine there are a lot of other things that you couldn't get them to budge or to compromise in any way with one another. They were willing to use this power that had been given to them in order to make worshiping God a crime. The second thing that stands out about this corruption of their human authority is they had contempt for those who were in higher authority than they were. And that's really, when you think about why are people so disrespectful toward authority today, I think part of the reason is because they want to be the one in charge. And if they're not the one in charge, they can't fathom somebody else, telling them what to do. They can't stomach somebody else being able to command them and to tell them the things that they should be doing. And so notice how they spoke about Daniel in verse 13. That Daniel, which is of the children of the captivity of Judah, well, he was their boss. I mean, he was the guy who was in charge, one of the third highest appointed people within the kingdom, who the king thought to make number one overall. And so they didn't have a lot of respect for Daniel, even though he had a position of higher authority than they did. The Bible teaches us as Christians that one thing that should set us apart from people of the world is our respect for authority. And that's true in any realm. I mean, that's true whether we're talking about the president or the ruler of our country, whether we're talking about authority within the family unit, whether it be the husband and wife relationship, whether it be the parent and child relationship. There should be a difference in our conduct than that within the world. That's true when it comes to law enforcement. That's true when it comes to the idea of work or structure within our employment, within our work environment. It's true within the church. We should have a great respect for those in authority, and it's ultimately true of God himself. There should be a difference in the life of a Christian when it comes to authority and our feelings and our respect toward them than there is that within the world. Remember Peter when he wrote in 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 10, he talked about those people who walked after the lust of the flesh and uncleanness. He says this about them in verse 10. He says, they despise government, presumptuous are they, self-willed, they are not afraid to speak evil of dignities. You know any people today who despise government? I mean, God tells us in Romans chapter 13 that the government is a divine institution. It's something that God created and established for man's betterment. And do people abuse it? Yes, they do. I mean, there's no doubt about that. But if you despise the institution of government itself, you despise something God created. And that's a very dangerous situation. These people were not afraid to speak evil of dignities. They despised governments. And what's interesting, notice verse 11 there in 2 Peter chapter 2. It says, whereas angels, which are greater in power and might, bring not railing accusations against them before the Lord. The angelic beings who are much more powerful than we are, they're mightier than we are. They have a higher ranking in heaven than we do right now. But those people would not even dare to do something like that. They see government as something from God. And we're willing to do something that they themselves are afraid to do. That's what the point that he's making there. Well, these people had disregard for human authority all the way around. As Christians, that should be something different that people don't see within our lives. And then the third thing that I'll mention is they used their human authority, their powers, to convict those who were innocent, the clean. Notice in verse 15, these men assembled unto the king. They said unto the king, they reminded Darius of this. Darius is out here and he's kind of at his wit's end. He's trying to figure out a way out of this. But they come to him and they remind him. They say, know this, O king. This is the law of the Medes and the Persians. Okay, and we know this about the law of the Medes and the Persians. No decree or no statute that the king makes can be changed. In other words, once the king says it's going to happen, it has to happen. And the king eventually came to grips with that reality in verse 16. And that's why he commands Daniel to be cast into the den of lions. Daniel hadn't done anything wrong. Daniel hadn't committed, he certainly hadn't committed anything that was worthy of death. But they sought to kill him anyway. Does that sound familiar? Think about Jesus. The most innocent man that ever lived here upon this earth. Did nothing wrong. Absolutely nothing. Certainly didn't do anything that was worthy of death. And yet what did this world do? It put him to death. And that's really been the operation of God's people from the beginning of time. You go back to the relationship of Cain and Abel, and you can see it from the beginning in that. Remember, Paul made this statement. In fact, I think Dennis mentioned it on Wednesday night in his Devo. In 2 Timothy 3 and verse 12, Paul wrote, "Yea, and all that live godly in Christ Jesus shall suffer persecution." As God's people take their stand for what is right, as we live in this world and we do what the Lord has commanded us to do, in every age, the followers of God have been falsely accused. They have been cruelly persecuted. They have been unjustly killed. Persecuting the innocent has just been part of the theme of God's people from the beginning of time. And so they use this power, this human authority that they have, to cruelly abuse and persecute Daniel. I'd invite you to read the rest of that chapter. We're going to talk about some of it, Lord willing, tonight. But think about this great contrast that exists through this chapter. The contrast between the followers of God and the unbelievers of the world. And what you'll see as you read through this is there's a significant difference in their lives as they're being lived out here upon this earth. My question for us this morning is this: are you different? Does God see that difference? Or if somebody was to look at our lives versus the lives of the world today, would they see that distinctiveness? Would they see that characteristic of difference that exists there? What about our character? Would they be confident in us? Would they view us as people of impeccable character? As people that are trustworthy, that have their best interest at heart? Or would they be a little bit cynical about our desires and our motives in doing things here upon this earth? What about our conduct? Would they see us trying to make what is right into being something wrong? Or trying to make what is wrong into being something right? Or are we the type of people that are going to stick with God's word no matter what? Do they see us trying to use flattery and deception to try to get our way? Or are we like Daniel, just people who are sticking with it and sticking with God's word no matter what's happening to us? And what about our human power that has been entrusted to us, whether it be in the church, whether it be in the workplace, whether it be within the family unit? Are we using that power for good or for evil? Are we disrespectful toward those who are in higher authority over us? Are we trying to convict those who are innocent as being guilty? All those are good questions for us to think about. Maybe there's one here this morning, though, who has never obeyed the gospel of Christ.